Today we're going to talk about a car that seemingly everyone loves to hate, and that is the 1982 to 1988 Cadillac Cimarron. It seems like on internet forums and Facebook pages and everywhere else you go these days, someone offers an opinion about the Cadillac Cimarron, and it's almost always negative. And while some of the criticism is admittedly justified, I don't think that the amount of criticism that the car receives is necessarily justified for a number of reasons. Yes, the Cimarron, when it was first introduced, was not much more than a gussied-up Cavalier, but as time went on, the car got better and better to the point that the later Cimarrons, I would say from 1985 on, are actually pretty fun to drive, especially if you have the V6 engine, and are not bad cars. They're pretty fun to own. I say that as the owner of a 1986 V6-powered Cimarron. But today we're going to expose a number of probably unknown facts to you about this vehicle and explain a little bit more about how it came to be in the process. If you feel that I've missed something on the Cimarron, be sure to drop a comment in the comment section and let me know what you like about this series. Also give it a like or a thumbs up, as that will help the viewership. Let's get started with number 10. And at number 10, we have that this particular baby Cadillac used a single-stage paint until the 1987 model year. Now, you have to remember that the larger Cadillacs were using a lot better painting processes by this point than just your run-of-the-mill single-stage paint. Cadillac Civilles and the full-size vehicles, for instance, had base coat, clear coat for a number of years prior to 1987, but the Cimarron, I guess, owing to its J-car platform origins, kept with a single-stage paint until the 1987 model year. So what does that mean? Well, it means that you have to be a little bit more careful and care for the car a little bit better, and it may require polishing or buffing as the single-stage paint sometimes hazes over time. In general, single-stage paint isn't a bad thing, but I will say that for anybody who's owned an old car, it does mean that you should keep your car waxed more often, and that will really help prevent the discoloration and also keep it shiny. So it's a bit more maintenance, but this was I think this was actually the last Cadillac to use a single-stage paint and one of the last General Motors cars to still use a single-stage paint. It's kind of funny on this relatively expensive Cadillac. Let's move on to number 9, and that is that the Cimarrons actually have a relatively sporty suspension. Now, I have to think that many buyers of the Cimarron, or at least interested prospects who took a look at the vehicle, had anticipated that the car would have kind of that traditional Cadillac floaty boat ride. But once they test drove the Cimarron, I have a feeling that quite a few were not so pleased with what they experienced on the test drive, namely that the Cimarron actually had a pretty gosh darn sporty suspension, and there was even an optional sporty suspension package in a number of years that further stiffened the ride. And I'm the owner of one of the latter cars. My 86 Cimarron does have the optional sport suspension package, which also came with larger wheels and tires, including Blackwall tires with white lettering on them. That was a factory option. And the result is that the car is very fun to drive. It feels, like I said, extremely sporty. It handles very well. It's almost like a little go-kart. These cars are so small by modern-day standards. It's almost humorous. But it gives the car this kind of fun-to-drive factor. But I really don't think that that was what the typical buyer, or I'll say interested prospect of the Cimarron, was necessarily looking for. GM tuned the suspension to be more of an import fighter. And perhaps it's one of the first Cadillacs, aside from, let's say, the 76 Seville, that was trying to be an import fighter. It was a small car and competing against the BMW 3 Series. No, don't chuckle when I say that. But as a result, the suspension setup was quite firm. And I'll just tell you, this car is not a floaty boat. It is not a soft ride. It's a very sporty ride. And that's good and bad. I tend to enjoy it. It's something different from a typical Cadillac. But like I said, I have a feeling that many interested prospects and buyers did not actually enjoy that. Let's move on to number 8, and that is that the Cimarron shares its seats with the Eldorado Touring Coupe. Now, Cadillac introduced its downsized Eldorado for the 1979 model year. Of course, there was the Bustleback Seville that followed in the 1980 model year. But after a few model years in 1983, Cadillac introduced the Eldorado Touring Coupe. And this happens to be my favorite Eldorado of the 1979 to 1985 generation. I love the blackout trim, the lack of the stand-up hood ornament, the lack of the vinyl top, and the beautiful wheels on the Eldorado Touring Coupe. But a little known fact about the Eldorado Touring Coupe is that it actually plucked the Cimarron seats from the Cimarron and employed those in the car. Now, that seems strange. How could you put a J car, compact car seat in such a big car? But the Eldorado had a rather large center console, and that took up a fair amount of the space inside the vehicle. And I guess it was thought that the seats in the Cimarron were quite sporty, in keeping with the Eldorado Touring Coupe's vibe, if you will. And they kind of work. They're a little bit narrow, I would say, by modern day standards, but if you wanted something sporty, they are comfortable, and I guess Cadillac saved some money by employing these seats in its Eldorado Touring Coupe. Let's move on to number 7. And at number 7, we are going to complain a bit about the flimsiest control in the Cimarron. That is the power mirror control. Well, why am I complaining about this? Well, a lot of cars during the era had power mirror controls, and GM, especially the Cadillacs, tended to have this little joystick that mirrored the joystick on the manual remote mirror controls. But in this case, it was power. And on many Cadillacs, this is kind of a non-event. I mean, it's like operating a power window switch. But the Cimarron power mirror joystick is just terrible. It's absolutely terrible. It's flimsy. And as a consequence, they tended to break very frequently. Almost every Cimarron that you see that has a power mirror control, that little joystick is broken. And so my best advice to you is if you have a Cimarron, be extremely gentle with that control, as now these cars are, in some cases, 40 years old, and the control is even more brittle than it was back at the start of its lifetime. And set the power mirrors and forget about it. Don't touch them. Just leave them. You're better off not to be messing around with this joystick control because it is ultra, ultra flimsy. And because it's flimsy, replacements are very hard to come by, so you're best just to leave it. Let's move on now to number 6. And at number 6, let's return back to the seats in the Cimarron by noting that you could actually get credit for optioning cloth seats in your Cimarron. Now, Cimarrons came standard with leather seats all the way back to the beginning. They started out as perforated leather seats, and they later lost the perforation, but the nice leather seating areas remained. However, what you could option if you wanted in a number of model years is cloth in your Cimarron, and you got a credit on the invoice for the cloth option. In fact, as you can see here, my 1986 Cimarron does have this credit cloth seat option. And I have to say, as somebody who's not really a fan of leather, I think leather is overused. It's become so ubiquitous in even the lowest end vehicles these days that I actually appreciate cloth. It's not too hot in the summer. It's not too cold in the winter. It breathes. You don't have to worry about heated and cooled seats. And you stick in the seat better, especially with this particular fabric that they employed in the Cimarron. And so I tend to like it. I'm actually happy that my Cimarron has it. But few people know that you could get the credit cloth option in your Cimarron. Let's move on to number 5. And at number 5, we have an unfortunate element of the Cimarron's history, and that is that it actually was originally intended to be based on the X-Car platform, that of the Chevrolet Citation, Pontiac Phoenix, Olds Omega, and Buick Skylark. Now, why do I say that this is unfortunate? Well, I actually think that if the Cimarron had been based on the X-Car platform, it might have been viewed as a success. The X-Car was quite a bit bigger than the J-Car, both wider and longer, and I do think that overall, people would have accepted the Cimarron a bit better if it had been based on that X-Car platform. The J-Car was just, I think, a little bit too small. So then what happened? Why did the final Cimarron not end up being produced on the X-Car platform? Well, one simple reason. The General Motors program planners didn't believe that there was any production capacity at the X-Car assembly plants to make a Cimarron and add an additional model. And why is this? Well, remember that when Chevrolet came out with the Citation in 1980, that Chevrolet sold about 800,000 Citations in that model year. 800,000 of the Chevrolet Citation alone. That doesn't count the Phoenix or the Omega or the Buick Skylark, that's just the Citation. And yes, it was a bit of an extended model year for 1980, but still, 800,000 units. The plants were running at capacity during the time that the Cimarron was being devised. And as a result, there just was no capacity, or at least there was not the view that there was going to be capacity to produce a Cadillac X-Car. Now, program planners didn't realize that X-Car volumes would be cut significantly every year thereafter, in part because they were, I think at the time, the most recalled vehicles that existed. And as a result, Citation sales almost dropped in half every model year thereafter. And there would have been the appropriate production capacity, but that was not known at the time that program planners were devising the Cimarron. So unfortunately, it moved to the Cavalier or J-Car platform as opposed to being on the Citation or X-Car platform. Let's move on to number 4. And at number 4, we have that the Cimarron in its first year was equipped with a very unfortunate 1-year-only 1.8-liter 4-cylinder engine. Now, this 1.8-liter engine was employed across the board in all J cars for the 1982 model year and the 1982 model year alone, one model year. That tells you all you need to know about how customers felt about this particular engine. They really just loathed it. It was a wheezer. It didn't make good noises. It had electronic carburetor feedback issues. It just was not viewed favorably. And I think the 0 to 60 time on the 1982 Cimarron was about 16 seconds. And frankly, when GM was planning these J cars, they were targeting about 15 to 16 seconds, 0 to 60. And of course, they were targeting optimal fuel economy, and it was felt that a 1.8-liter engine was what was going to fit the bill. Well, of course, by the time the cars actually rolled out, fuel prices were plummeting. Remember, this was several years now after the second OPEC embargo. And customers just wanted more power. They cared less about fuel economy. They wanted more zip. And they were getting out of cars with big V8 engines or powerful engines. And to get somebody to go into a downsized vehicle, particularly a Cadillac buyer to go into a Cimarron, imagine somebody who had a Cadillac previously that was used to V8 power going into this car. It just was not acceptable. And the 1.8-liter engine was also a parts bin engine from the Chevrolet V6, the 2.8-liter V6. It employed the same valve train, I believe the same pistons. It used a lot of the same components, and it literally was just kind of a parts bin engine that was cobbled together. It was not engineered from the start to be a clean sheet 4-cylinder engine. And as a result, it was just abysmal. Now, the 2-liter engine that came out in 1983, which had fuel injection, was actually a pretty good little engine. And that 2.3 would later become the 2.2-liter engine. And I should mention that all of these, the 1.8 that I'm talking about here, is an overhead valve engine. Don't confuse it with the Brazilian-sourced 1.8 overhead cam engine. Two totally different engines. But that little 1.8 would become a 2-liter, which would become a 2.2-liter. And in those forms, it actually was a pretty good and reliable engine. In fact, I would say some of the later 2.2 engines, when outfitted in Cavaliers, they were pretty bulletproof. They lasted forever. And actually, they weren't unpleasant engines at all. They got good fuel economy. They were durable. I've driven Cavaliers with them, and I have to say, they're not bad. So it all started with humble beginnings, though, and this awful 1.8-liter engine. Next, let's go to number 3, and that is that the Cimarron, when it was first introduced, was actually not perceived by internal GM insiders as a car that was going to be overly successful. Now, what do I mean by this? Why launch a car that was not going to be successful in the first place? Well, you have to understand that this was not a car that actually was initiated by Cadillac program planning. In fact, the reason behind the introduction of the Cimarron was the dealer body. The dealer body was clamoring for a small car to compete against imports, particularly those on the West Coast. They were relating that they were getting killed in sales by the BMWs and Mercedes. And so the dealer body was just up in arms over the fact that the Cadillac portfolio had nothing in it to satisfy this product gap. And they wanted a solution, and they wanted it now, or they were going to basically get rid of their Cadillac franchise. So General Motors program planners really had a gun to their head during this time frame in terms of bringing out a new vehicle. And it takes about, at least back at this time frame, it would take 3 to 4 years to bring a new vehicle to market, from initiating the project kickoff to the start of production. And the dealers were not going to accept that. They were not going to wait 3 to 4 years for, I'll call it, the right car to come out. And so that left Cadillac in this precarious position. What do? We can't have our dealers just leaving us in droves. We have to fill the gap. And that resulted in the Cimarron, which was really a car that was launched in less than 12 months from initial conception to start of production. And when that's the case, you're not changing sheet metal, you're not changing any hard parts on the car, you're not changing powertrains or suspensions by and large, maybe some minor components here or there. All you can really work with is the interior soft trim, some of the fascias, the soft trim on the outside, and that's it. That's all you can do. Wheels and tires, I guess, too, you could say. And so the 1982 Cimarron in particular, when it first came out, was basically a Cavalier with a different grille, different taillights, different bumpers, and some wheels and tires, and a different interior, and that was it. Now, that was not what GM thought was going to be successful. That was not what designers wanted. Designers didn't want anything like that, as we're going to see. And nobody was really happy with the vehicle that they came out with. But it was a choice of, do we come out with nothing, or do we come out with a car that we know is imperfect, try to improve it over time, and basically placate the dealer body? And that's what happened. They came out with the car, and actually over time, as I mentioned, the Cimarron, 3 years after its introduction, was actually a pretty pleasant car. By 1985, it had a V6, it had some unique sheet metal, it looked better, and that's really what I would say the program planners wanted. In fact, as you just heard, the program planners even wanted a bigger car. They wanted an X car. So not only did Cadillac not get the size vehicle that it wanted, it also had to rush something to market and just didn't have any time to do so. And the result was, well, what you got with the Cimarron that was launched. And at number 2, we have that the Cimarron had some interesting alternate names that were not selected for it. You can see them on this piece of paper right here. So take a look at some of these names that were not selected for the Cimarron. You have the El Cid, the Madrid, the Mallorca, the San Moritz, the Fontainebleau, and some other things, the Cadillac Lamplighter, the Yorktown, the Bordeaux, and the list goes on and on. But this was actually the list of considered names for the Cimarron. This is from a friend of the program, John Manoogian, who was a designer on the Cimarron program. By the way, you can check out the video with John Manoogian of the design of the Cimarron, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to number 1. But John also has published a story of his design career. He's published a number of parts to it, and I'll put a link in the description if you want to learn more about the history of John and General Motors design. It's just a great series of articles. In any case, this is the list of names that were considered for the Cimarron, and I just thought it was pretty humorous. I don't know that Cimarron was the best one either, but I think it's better than a lot of the ones on here. The LaSalle, too, the Junior LaSalle. I'm guessing that's what J. LaSalle is. I could just keep going and reading the list, but you can read it for yourself and chuckle. Put a comment in the comment section. Which name would you have selected for the Cimarron? Would you have selected something else? Let's move on to number 1, and that is that the Cimarron designers wanted something completely different from the vehicle that ended up being produced. Now, you have to remember, go back to what I said, that this car was rushed through to production. There was not time to change the sheet metal, and as a result, designers were really handcuffed when it came to this vehicle. But let's examine some of the sketches that a designer, John Manoogian, who was the Cadillac assistant chief designer during this time frame, here's some of his proposals, and they don't look a lot like the final version of the car. I think they look a lot better. But obviously John couldn't get what he wanted because of the time constraints that I mentioned. And special treat, here's a picture of 2 production Cimarrons and then a proposal for a second generation Cimarron that was based on the full-size airbrush rendering that you just saw. And if you think that full-size mock-up here doesn't look like the airbrush rendering, well, you're not alone. I don't think it looks like it much at all, but I think that the airbrush rendering got watered down pretty significantly, probably because it was viewed as not Cadillac-y enough and, well, maybe too radical. But here we are. Here is the proposal. So what do you think of this potential second generation Cimarron? And here's a rear view of the second generation Cimarron as well. Not a bad looking car, but not an overly great looking car either. I much prefer the airbrush rendering that John did. By the way, check out the interview with John also in the comment section. So what do you think about the Cimarron overall? Was this something that was helpful? Did you find any new facts out about the car that you didn't know before? Let me know. Put a comment in the comment section. Thanks again for watching.